Welcome to the Power and Market Podcast. This is our weekly current events podcast where we take a more brisk look at a lot of the week's events here at the Mises Institute. And with me, as usual, is Tho Bishop and also Connor O'Keefe, both of whom are contributing editors and columnists here at the Mises Institute. You can see their works very often at Mises.org. That's MISES.org. And so we're going to talk about some columns that have appeared on the site this week and also just some news items that maybe didn't quite rise to the level of requiring an article, but which we feel the need to express some opinions about. And how can we ignore the divorce and breakup of Elon Musk and Donald Trump? Of course, if you follow social media at all, as I do, it's all over the place. I don't know how the mainstream media, like the legacy media, has been covering it, but of course, it's just it's on everyone's to-do list when it comes to commentary in social media right now. So, though, I think I'm just gonna, you have a better sense of these people and what they're saying and what the thinking is with this. So. Why don't you just kind of give us the basics of this situation between Elon and Trump? And is this something that matters? I mean, obviously, there's always that skeptical side of it, too. Is this just a psyop to take our minds off the Palantir thing, which some people have certainly said, or maybe it's to take our minds off of Ukraine? I don't know. There's also that issue. But I mean, at least the information as presented, as far as I can see, kind of the events right on their face, seems to be these two guys are mad at each other. So is that true? And how mad and how long are they going to be mad? And does it matter for people who are actually in favor of freedom?
Before I get into the juicy divorce, do want to mention to our listeners the Supporters Summit 2025 that we got coming up on October 16th down in beautiful Delray Beach. We got Jim Bovard, who's going to be our keynote speaker, along with a great list of great Mises Institute folks there, including most of us here on this. I think everyone here on this call. So definitely, if you want to continue this conversation and the many more that we're going to have here on Power and Market, you can find more about that event at Mises.org/events. And so, with that shameless promotion out of the way, it is. I think the most interesting aspect of this, in some ways, is the fact that this Musk-Trump relationship lasted as long as it did. You're doing with two very large personalities, two very large egos. And, I don't think this break is all that surprising, because if you really kind of been following Elon's X account for several months now, he has definitely kind of found his libertarian phase, at least when it comes to content, right? He loves publishing videos by Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman. And he has not yet discovered Rothbard, but give us another 2 weeks. We'll see how that goes. And so you've had this very clear public ideological bent from Elon that is very much out of fashion with most of the policy intellectual class around Donald Trump, which constantly attacks libertarianism as being either completely ineffective to the current challenges of the political left, or at worst, kind of, submissive handmaidens, kind of just, allowing for the justification in terms of various cultural issues and the like. And when you add in the tension of tariffs, when you add in, there was a big blowout between Elon and a lot of the MAGA base when it came to H-1B visas and sort of the skilled immigration aspect of it. You've had Steve Bannon in particular, who definitely is an embodiment of a large percentage of kind of that Trump base, who has been taking shots at Elon for quite some time, that has always been very skeptical of his machinations. And you combine it with a number of political defeats for Musk. I know a lot has been said about the subsidies to electric vehicles. So Musk has, at least a record that you can check in terms of downplaying that aspect of it. But like his choice for NASA was removed, earlier this week before he attacked the big, beautiful bill. Trump has given some cookies to Sam Altman, which is a massive feud within Silicon Valley. And so you kind of saw, it wasn't surprising to see this massive blow up here. How quickly and how fast it all, engulfed in flames on Thursday was certainly something to behold. But there's been this tension here between this marriage. I think the disappointment with Doge, which I think also comes within the administration. I think there was some that was hoping that was going to be an easy button, and Elon did not really that effort that Elon led did not really live up to that promise. There's some interesting reporting about conflicts with Scott Besson in particular on that topic. Is that I don't think this should be at all surprising. There's obviously, it was a great day if you were Thomas Massie or Rand Paul that got some big reinforcements on their own criticisms of the bill that is now in front of the Senate.
Yeah, Connor, I mean, what was your impression when you first saw this? Did you think it was a significant change or inevitable? Or
I sort of thought it was inevitable. I'm in the same boat. I kind of expected it to happen a lot earlier, and I'm kind of pleased too that, when it did happen, that it seemed to be over the spending issue, and that Musk really was pushing this idea that the Republicans are selling out and they're just going to greenlight more spending, which is that's what we've been saying. So if they were going to fall out over anything, I was definitely happy it was this.
Well, I mean, that's a good segue into, I think, really the meat of this issue is if it really is over the budget issue, that's a big deal. And we've talked about that a little bit on the previous episode of this. But you can see the factions that have formed somewhat, right? And I guess this would fit into Tho's theory that Elon has chosen to align himself more with the libertarian wing of things, right? Is because you got the Massey Rand, and maybe it's the Massey Rand Musk wing of things where it's look, the big beautiful bill is garbage. It doesn't really change anything significantly at all, and there's no reason to really expend any political capital trying to pass it. And obviously that makes Trump very angry, as I would expect, because he talks about a great historic bill, very important, et cetera, whereas, right, Rand and Massey are what does it really change? And I would say, really, with the exception of a few things, it's pretty much just the status quo, right? I do think someone who's been doing a good job on it, even though he's really not telling quite the truth, and his posts are right. If you can see through the usual Washington garbage, you see they're really stretching the reality of things. But Stephen Miller, he's really taken to Twitter to start cranking out all these posts about the big beautiful bill and really emphasizing the immigration side of it. And I think that's the only part of this bill that isn't just status quo, is that it seems to have some real provisions in there for actually funding serious border control. The claim by Miller, at least, is that it fully funds the wall, by the time Trump leaves. If that's true, that's a big change in the status quo. But in terms of actual fiscal policy and everything, I just don't see any significant change. And I even got an email from a diehard libertarian scholar today saying that he had looked more into some detail into the CBO report on it and everything, and that hey, it looks like there's real cuts in here. Even if it does drive a higher deficit. But I think Massey hits the nail on the head on this, is that all of those cuts are over 10 years. Mm-hmm. All of those cuts are at some point in the future. There will be cuts. And Massey has said anything out farther than 3 years is just nothing. It doesn't mean anything. And significantly, a lot of the stuff that Trump has put in there too, it's scheduled to not take effect until 2028. So they're specifically avoiding having this administration have to take any of the political responsibility for any of the cuts, which means they're not going to happen, which means by the time the next administration comes in, there's going to be a new reality and they do cuts. And remember, all of this stuff is premised on there being no recession. That's something to always keep in mind too, about CBO reports and anything coming out of those sorts of offices. He has a really rosy picture of the economy and assumes that tax revenues are going to be great and solid and continuing just like they are. And also that there's not going to be a financial crisis freak out where the federal government comes in and says, we got to spend an extra $1 trillion to deal with stimulating the economy or because there's more unemployed. That's what happens every time there's a recession lately. And so it acts like none of that will never happen. So it's just, Miller is nice that he points out these things in the report, in the bill, that in an ideal world might actually work. But the reality is it's complete fantasy land stuff. And maybe the immigration stuff, if it actually happens, would be a change. But other than that, I just don't see anything worth getting excited about in the big, beautiful bill.
Well, that's kind of the problem here is that Washington is not built for creating anything that resembles a solution. So there are some interesting components, right, about changes to Medicaid that require work requirements, like that's something we could cheer for, right? But a lot of the math involved is there's high expectations for growth, and maybe those happen. I mean, there's people will talk about the AI. The potential for AI and its impact on real economic growth, and also just concerns on the other end of it, particularly when it comes to jobless rates and things like that. That sort of trade-off is baked in. I think that some of the challenges that come into this, though, is that again, one of the key aspects that went into getting this bill passed through the House was giving a bailout to blue states governments, with the salt, with the way that they handled salt, and so the way that the sausage is made has not changed at all, which is no one should have expected a magic wand to fix these sort of problems, right? All these goes to the far deeper problem, which is that Washington is a place where real ideas go to die. So there's some justifications there, and the other side of it is that what is the ask that could significantly improve that? Anything that what Massey wants, anything that what Rand wants is not going to get done, and I think that's what breeds some of that frustration there. But the reality of it though is that if a lot on the right are operating with the assumption that the economy of today is very similar to what it was in 2016, and so therefore all these concerns about debt, deficits, government spending, we can kind of just we can avoid them right now because it's a problem. Some of them will pay lip service like we need to get this addressed eventually, but right now we've got to do big boy things. We've got to really yield our power in the right. And then the problem is that you have Treasury. The cost of borrowing money has gone up. Like there's a lot less slack in the line. And we've been pounding this table ever since Trump got elected, is that assuming that you can get away with the sort of deficit spending that administrations have been able to get into the past is we're living in a different world. And like those realities and that disruption are very much on the table. And I think that's what you add in the tariff component to it, which scares the hell out of a lot of small businesses that make up a large part of the Trump administration base right now. Like how these policies that are being acted on right now are going to be perceived a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now is ignoring our economic analysis, right? Ignoring our criticism there. Those are very real political considerations that I don't think have been fully taken at face value from the perspective of the Trump right are not fully being appreciated right now.
Yeah, but overall, I guess to a point that you make a lot, though, like that's all true. But like, there's just so many structural barriers, especially with Congress here. Like, I never went into this with the expectation that Congress, just because they're all Republican, they're gonna, finally come and they've finally come into the position where they can, cut spending and cut the deficit like they always claim to want to do. Like, that's not what Congress is set up to do. And so my point is not really that that the spending issue is like something we can realistically expect if we're, just like loud enough about it, Congress to actually come around and change. But, on the flip side, I do think there's kind of a counterfactual to that too, where I think they would be even worse if there weren't people kind of screaming about this stuff. Sure. And I think that the fact that Musk has sort of made this an issue, whether or not, it's genuine, he is talking about it. He's talking about it a lot. And so even though I don't expect that to, lead to any serious tangible change with this Congress specifically, or even with Congress as an institution in the next, couple of decades or, the near future, I do think it's valuable that this conversation is happening, and the fact that the world's richest man, probably one of the most famous men in the world right now, has made this his pet issue and has gotten really aggressive with it in the last few days, especially. I think that's by itself a good thing.
Yeah, well, and like the counterfactual here is that something that could have built up perhaps an element of trust, if you will, that could have built up capital and kind of a serious nature to some of these underlying concerns, which has been, Republican frustration, Republican voter frustrations for quite some time, is like if they would have done some of the Doge rescission cuts prior to this bill, right? And even as small as they are and as disappointing as the total package was and all that sort of stuff, right? Like they could have gotten that done and then done this. The problem is that what they would have quickly found is that the support amongst Republican politicians for that would not have been there, which would have embarrassed them, which would have damaged the negotiations on this. And so like that's the real problem here, is that Congress and the majority of Republicans in Congress don't want to do the most minor cuts possible. And so in order to have, get that team together to get, some of these other policy, the border and some of this sort of stuff, they're having to play cover for people that are completely out of line with what Trump voters want. And so it's this entire sort of shell game they're having to play with, given how unserious our current political environment is.
Well, just imagine if the conversation wasn't taking place, right? This is what a lot of the do whatever Trump wants people get wrong, is that if you just follow the lead of the guy who's in charge and you don't provide any pushback, you don't force an actual debate, and you don't actually ask for what you think is better, and you don't criticize just how much that the suggested legislation has come up short, don't be surprised when it gets even worse the next time they try to do it. Because imagine if Trump puts out a budget and everyone's like, well, I'm sure it's just part of 10D chess, and don't complain because I'm sure it's part of a bigger plan. Well, then the next year when we're talking about the budget, he's going to be like, well, I didn't get any pushback last time, so I guess I can push it a little bit more in terms of spending and make it a little bit worse, just to pad it, give more freebies to my supporters and everything, because no one's going to push back. And so for anyone who has like an actual conscience, the whole point is it's totally incumbent upon you to actually speak up and say, look, this is not good enough. You need to do something better. Now, in the end, right, you're probably not going to get what you want, but you might push it a little bit more in a less terrible direction. And that's what doing good is about, not this whole, oh, well, the smart guys are in charge and we're just going to do whatever they want and make it easy on them. Because if you make it easy on the politicians, they're going to take it in a worse direction, 100%. And so you need to make it difficult. You need them to remember next time, oh, yeah, I tried to do that bad stuff and I had to negotiate and I had to go through 10 rounds of changes and all of that stuff. And boy, I don't want to do that whole thing again. So I'll move a little bit further in a better direction. That's how the process works. And they always accuse us of being naive, right? Oh, well, you're not giving your undying and totally unmitigated support to Trump. You don't understand how the process works. No, I understand very well how the process works. I understand that if you don't push back at all, you just keep getting worse and worse stuff from politicians. That's how it works. So these people just trying to tell me, oh, get in line and just do whatever Trump says, because how can you impugn the name of the great leader? You're asking for trouble. You're asking for, like, even within the next 3.5 years, you're asking for stuff to get worse and worse. We're not even talking about the next guy, whoever that happens to be. So, of course, this is a long way of just saying, yeah, I mean, obviously I'm glad that people like Musk that are speaking up about it. And I think the critique is valid. The critique is good. I don't know what his plan is, what the end point is. But the fact that that doubts are in their heads about, oh, is the big, beautiful bill quite as beautiful as we're being told? Of course there should be doubts. And of course people should feel like they have to go look at it. And also it exposes other garbage that shouldn't be taking place in Washington, right? The fact that it was yet another one of those bills where you get it in the middle of the night and it's like thousands of pages long and nobody reads it and then they vote on it anyway. This is all shameful, disgusting stuff that people in Washington should be ashamed of. And so it's good that when people question the bill, it highlights this stuff and forces people to defend themselves. That's the way it's supposed to work. Otherwise, you're just basically giving a blank check to people in Washington. That just seems like a terrible policy to me. So yeah, great. Glad that Musk is bringing it up. And of course, Massey and Rand, I always like their critiques as well.
Yeah, when you don't get debate, you get the COVID bill.
Yes.
Right.
100%. Right. Not just, of course, all the horrible COVID, directly related COVID lockdowns, but their horrible budget too.
Yeah.
Right. Which they didn't want to, they just wanted to do unanimous consent in Congress on that budget bill. Yeah, you're right. No debate, literally no debate on that. So
yeah, it's a great example.
Right.
For sure. All
right. Well, moving on to the next topic here, Palantir. This was another fun topic on social media this week. It's been building up for a couple of weeks, right? And it's obviously not all Trump, right? But Trump's the president now, so this means that it's his responsibility now in terms of what's going on. And it's just the latest step in terms of government partnering with these private sector groups to create new and quote unquote better and more quote unquote efficient tools for government to process private information, track information, and a lot of things that when I look at it, I see this as kind of a continuation yet again of the George W. Bush years, where it was a similar phenomenon, at least as far as I can tell. You have 9/11 happen. You have, of course, what they clearly had already on a shelf. It was already written. They were just waiting for the time to pass it, which was the Patriot Act. There was clearly a party that was already pushing for that behind the scenes. Patriot Act comes out. And then for the next 6-7 years, we got to hear about how you can't oppose any of these new spy programs because then the bad guys will win. If you don't let the NSA spy on you, then you have then the terrorists win. If you've done nothing wrong, then you have nothing to hide. You have nothing to worry about. And it seems like I'm hearing a lot of the same garbage from the pro-Palantir people, and the administration's actually been kind of reticent about it, I guess because they've been getting so much pushback. It's kind of fallen to the actual defense tech sector to defend themselves, and Palantir people who are defending themselves and saying, hey guys, this isn't like actually a new database. So I guess I need to go into some of the more foundational details. So a few days ago, earlier in the week, the New York Times, which, this just shows how partisan the New York Times is. There's no way they would have published this article if like Joe Biden was president, right? But they nevertheless, because Trump is president and is potentially embarrassing for Trump, they're pointing out how Palantir is helping the U.S. government, and of course it's all being funded by your tax dollars. There's a huge contract with the federal government. Palantir is helping the federal government, largely using a lot of the data hoovered up, sucked up by Doge, from all of these different government agencies, but also just data that the government agencies already had. And Palantir is helping them organize, analyze, and basically, I would say, weaponize this data, making it much easier for the federal government to take all of this stuff that's difficult to view and process without AI tools. That Palantir is saying, hey guys, we can help you put together all of this data that we can, part of the whole very origins of Palantir, as we see in a lot of the great work done by Whitney Webb, is that it's kind of the end goal has been total information awareness, which is along with sort of this CIA adjacent program and sort of a pre-crime program of sorts, right? Where we can identify the bad guys before they become bad guys. And of course, that's how they phrase it, right? Who is the bad guy? Well, the government will decide at some point. The point is that it's this new AI tool that makes it much, much easier for the federal government to basically watch everybody, to spy on everybody, to keep track of everybody. So there was a lot of pushback on that. A lot of people on social media were like, is this what we signed up for when we voted for Trump? Is this the sort of thing we should be supporting? And then the Palantir people, right, these big tech drones, they just come back and they say, well, other countries do this, so I don't see what you're worried about. This is data that the government already controls. So this is just like a really advanced Excel spreadsheet. Imagine like we're taking an Excel spreadsheet and we're just making it easier to read it. I mean, this is the sort of stuff they're saying, that it's no big deal. So I was just very interested in how there was a lot of many disgruntled comments from Trump supporters thinking, here we go again with all of this spy stuff. I remember this from the Bush years, and now we're being told this is the great new step that we need to now fund with our own tax dollars. And I wonder if it's going to die out, if it's going to continue to be an issue, if it's going to be a problem for the Trump administration. I don't know, but it definitely raised the profile of the whole thing. It's been kind of like guys like me and a lot of the people who handle internet privacy issues. You've been keeping track of it for a number of years. But it seems that now this whole controversy has, thanks to the New York Times article and then also a lot of other sites that have magnified the issue, has somewhat entered the public consciousness. And I don't know where it's going to lead, but I think it's to the good that they brought this up. And I think it really just kind of raises yet again how a lot of these people in big tech are not your friends. They're government funded. They're part of that parasite class that gets tax dollars to do all of this stuff. And I'm just hoping that it opens up a significant rift between kind of your standard MAGA people and the swamp creatures who are in this big tech Pentagon alliance. But I don't know if that's going to happen. We'll have to see going forward.
Yeah, maybe. I think, and I don't know too much about this specific issue, but something that it's standing out to me right now, and maybe it's just because this write-up was in the New York Times and it's kind of fallen into the sort of the cultural political break. But it seems like Palantir specifically is more of the world of that kind of the tech sort of world. I know Peter Thiel is very involved with them, and he kind of has, his faction that have made their way into American politics. And they seem, certainly with the current administration, they're pretty aligned with it. It's so like there does seem to be a little bit of a dynamic in the conversation, at least right now. I don't know how far back this goes, where like the Palantir people are kind of more on the Trump side, and the New York Times, kind of the old regime, is sort of attacking them. And to the extent that that's accurate at all, I think it sort of feeds into this broader frustration that I've certainly had, especially the second time around with Trump. But it's kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, that for a large part of this, administration or movement, whatever you want to call it, they really just seem to want to continue with what was happening before. And like the feeling I get when I'm kind of seeing the Palantir people talk about the change they want to bring is it just all seems to be about making the security apparatus in DC more efficient. And I just think that is such a misreading of the issue that we've had in this country with our sort of national security, this national security state that's built up. And I think that you find that same kind of dynamic with a lot of different issues. I wrote a long article last summer about, I went through and I read the entirety of Project 2025 back when that was a thing. That really has not been mentioned since the election, but it was a long book. It took me a long time to get through it. But it was an issue where I felt like I couldn't get an honest read on it. People are either saying like it's literally the end of the world if you were against it, or it's like this great thing that's going to usher in a new, again, I wanted to say a new golden age, but that's Trump's thing. But basically, it's going to solve all of our problems. And then you read the thing, and then like, yeah, there's some good stuff in it, but for the most part, it's just about it's kind of this progressive cliche that like we just don't have the right people in charge, and if we just do it, if we being the sort of the MAGA movement, but specifically like this faction within the MAGA movement, if we just take over, then we're going to do it all right. And yeah, they might pay like lip service to like, oh, we should cut spending, we should not be fighting all these wars, but they'll kind of like, especially in that document, they sort of dismissed it as that's not realistic. So we're just going to assume that we'll completely take over, Washington, D.C., and then we can just run it the way we want. And I just feel like this whole Palantir discussion just seems like the latest chapter in that kind of, or it's the latest chapter of that kind of dynamic. And it's just, to me, it's like our issue was not that like, Saddam Hussein could have been captured a week earlier after the invasion of Iraq happened. Like, it's, yeah, okay, maybe some things could have been streamlined a little bit more, but like the problem was that we were invading Iraq and overthrowing Saddam Hussein for ridiculous reasons, and it was a complete disaster the way it played out. And I feel like this is just one more example of people that have taken the wrong lessons from the last 20 years or so.
Well, it's also interesting because, like, there's definitely tension within the Trump coalition on issues like Palantir. And so, like, someone who has, made some, obviously been very critical about Elon, this week in particular, but had taken shots at him prior to, and someone who has done similar sort of things, though not perhaps as explicit, with Peter Thiel and with David Sachs and the like, some of these, some of the Silicon Valley influence that was definitely part of, the 2024 coalition in particular, has been Steve Bannon. And Bannon has regularly talked about the concerns that he has about this broader AI environment of the tech influence and the like. And so to me, like, I think that's one of the most interesting dynamics of this going forward, is that within this coalition of movements, right, within the various coalitions of this current American right-wing movement, someone like a Bannon is someone who we have very strong disagreements on when it comes to trade policy or a variety of economic aspects of it, right? He's someone who is a big defender of Medicaid within some of these larger policy talks. But when it comes to this sort of issue, right, he's got his own sort of concerns when it comes to kind of this Silicon Valley solution to, AI tech, defense contractors, governing sort of style innovations there. And so I think that's one of the things that are going to be very interesting, because there is sort of this, all of this is within the shadow, as fortunate as, we want these topics to be independent of politics. You have these much deeper conversations going on about, what does JD Vance look like in 2028 and the influences on him? What does the future of this current political environment go to? And so Bannon in particular, I think, is interesting as someone who is a big source of tension between a lot of, massive, obviously, financial interests that have worked themselves into the current coalition.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's been so much talk, of course, about reining in organizations like USAID and all of these other government contractors, right? And I did a couple columns on that, right? I don't think people appreciate the full extent to which government contractors are driving federal spending and federal employment, right? People think way too much in terms of full-time employees, right? What we call FTE, right? When you're actually working for the government, they look at that and they're like, oh, that number's barely changed in 25, 30 years, right? If anything, it's gone down slightly. The reality, of course, is that the number of people who get their check, either directly or indirectly from the federal government, is huge. And then when we look at organizations like Palantir, also Amazon, all of these major, huge tech companies, and of course, this includes Elon's firms, right? Getting gigantic contracts from the federal government. That's not even counting your standard defense contracting firms like Raytheon and things like that. We're talking many, many billions of dollars, which, I mean, just heck, Palantir is already in almost $1 billion. And right, they're a relative newcomer with these big contracts, at least. I mean, they've been kind of around for a long time, but suddenly it's looking at, right, 100 million, 700 million, these sorts of numbers. They're just getting bigger and bigger. And there's a lot of people working on this. And I think there hasn't been nearly enough discussion about these huge tech firms and what they're doing and backing up the feds for.
Well, and it's worth noting that Palantir, again, obviously with the New York Times article and Peter Thiel and sort of stuff, is often kind of just thrown in there as sort of a Trump-aligned company. But of course, Palantir was doing a lot of work for the Biden administration. They did a lot of work in Europe going against far-right parties and like. The founder is someone who you do not necessarily associate with a red MAGA cap. Right, he's someone who has talked a lot about his concerns about right-wing extremism, within Europe and America and the like. And so this really is a bipartisan sort of component to it that often I think it's sold, with a MAGA cap, either by opponents of it, from the media that want to try to attach this to that, and then on the other side of making it easier to accept, because look, we're on your side of things. So that's something also to recognize within this component of, again, the tentacles of these large government contractors. They have no problem playing both sides of the political game.
Well, and of course, they give plenty of money to both sides of the political game. And to her credit, of course, Whitney Webb, who's probably done more work specifically about Thiel and Palantir and this side of things than anyone else I've seen, she was asked right in a Q&A, well, would Palantir even be doing this if Trump hadn't been elected? She's like, of course it wouldn't have made a difference, right? Is that we would have more or less the same trajectory. The things would be different in terms of details, right? If Doge didn't exist, the data collection would have manifested itself in a different way. But the reality is that, yeah, they're so deeply in bed with the Pentagon at this point that all of these firms, they've got 10 different ways of getting in, getting their contracts, getting involved. I guess it's the politics of it that helps keep continued support for firms like Palantir, because you say, oh, this is Trump's guy. And hey, MAGA, why aren't you supporting this? You should be on board with this because Trump supports it. So of course it must be good. And that's like a gift to these big tech firms, is that you're getting all of these supposed populists on board for supporting more money for these tech billionaires. And they're pursuing things that are blatant violations of the Fourth Amendment, blatant violations of general property rights. And you got suddenly these people who claim that they're against the status quo saying, yeah, of course we like these guys because they're doing good things for the Trump administration. That's a terrible way of going about it if you're actually pretending to be in favor of freedom. but it helps a lot. And I think that shows a lot of savvy on the part of these government contractors, that they know what they're doing. They're attaching themselves to certain groups at certain times, and they know that helps them in the end. Right. And it comes back to Thiel attaching himself to people like J.D. Vance and things like that. This isn't like it's not because there's a bro romance there, right? It's because this is a helpful thing for Peter Thiel to have Vance in his corner. And it's probably going to pay dividends in the future. And then, of course, it also gives Vance access to money. So we really need to look through this stuff at a realistic interest group and pressure group sort of lens. And some of it's ideological for sure, but a lot of it isn't. It's just people trading favors so that they can continue to stay in power and get more money for their corporation that makes the stock price go up. That's what's really fueling a lot of these guys. But something I just do like to emphasize is that, right, this isn't really the private economy, right? Nothing makes me more annoyed than when you're talking about like stockholders at Palantir, stockholders at like even worse, like Fannie or Freddie or something like that, pretending like they're part of free enterprise. They're not, and they should be treated accordingly. All right, well, we should get into the third topic here, which is the issue of courts. Now, I'll just let you, Connor, introduce this topic because you have a good article on this week talking about how, right, the courts aren't here to limit federal power. They're here to expand it and make justification for it. So, yeah, why don't you just introduce us to the general topic of what is the real role of the courts in American politics?
Yeah, well, it's what you just said there. I think this is a point that those who have been sort of swimming in Mises Institute circles for a long time are probably really familiar with, but I wanted to kind of write what could be like a quick, concise introduction to this idea, because for people that are outside of our circles, this might sound crazy or like it's just completely backwards. But I have been watching, over the last couple months as this administration has come to power, like it is clear that this whole Trump versus the courts dynamic is like quickly becoming like the defining dynamic of this second term. I mean, just about everything he's trying to do is getting tied up in the courts, especially, his biggest campaign promises. And he's losing a tremendous amount of these cases. And the headline that kind of grabbed me and convinced me now was the time to focus on this was that in May, he lost 96% of the cases brought before, federal courts of different levels there. And it was lower in previous months, but it was still really high. And of course, the establishment media they're sort of running with like the kind of elementary school view of the courts is like they're there to, it's checks and balances. They're there to watch the other branches, to watch Congress and watch the president and make sure they're not, overstepping and engaging in government overreach. And yeah, well, that's like a small part of what they do. It's not like that's been absent. I think as Rothbard really detailed well in a lot of his writing, especially, if you look at the actual history of the judicial branch, the much more enduring contribution to American history has been on the other side, where they're essentially giving their stamp of approval, their stamp of legitimacy to actual government overreach. The way Rothbard puts it is that, like, yeah, we tend to focus on the fact that, if they stamp something as unconstitutional, that means it cannot happen. The government cannot do that anymore. And they do occasionally do that with certain things. But oftentimes it's that stamp of constitutional, which means now nobody can complain here. This is a completely, entirely legitimate form of, this program, this government program is entirely legitimate. That has really been the thing that they've used a lot more. And if you just it's just so obvious. If you actually go read like the Bill of Rights and then look at all the things the federal government is doing, it is not clear how we got from, the text on those pages to our current status quo, unless you understand that all along the way, there were all these little steps where, usually through like because of political considerations or just like the ideology of the people that were going to law school and, going to those top law schools and finding themselves appointed to the Supreme Court by politicians. Of course, this is ridiculous. People try to frame it as a non-political organization. But anyway, that's a different topic. just throughout history, it's just been all of these cases where there's some government overreach, but the court says, oh, for whatever reason, this is fine. And once they stamp that approval on there, it's constitutional. That seals the issue for the most part. There's been a few instances of looking back, but for the most part, people just move on, and the Constitution grows. I talk about in the article, the Constitution that you can just find on the internet is not really what the courts are looking at when they're looking at these cases. They use what's called the Constitution annotated, which is the Constitution with all the annotations about those other cases. So they're looking back at what previous courts did. So whenever that stamp of approval is put on, like that feeds into, that fuels the growth in the future and kind of protects it, because they have all these cases to look back to. So that's sort of like the broad kind of Rothbardian characterization of the courts, which I think is a lot more accurate. And I think as this, becomes one of the big stories of this administration, it's important for people to have a more realistic understanding of what the system is and how it works than what they learned about in second grade.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the course has been where you've been able to launder political revolution in the country.
Yeah.
Right. It's picked and choose at times, right? There's been aspects of it, where certain egregious policies of FDR have been shot down, but for the most part, some of the growth of the administrative state was laundered through the courts. A lot of the excess of the Civil Rights Act was laundered through the courts and giving it that stamp of approval. You're having a little bit of a reaction to that currently with the current makeup of the courts. So you can even have a counter-revolution laundered through the courts with changes to DEI issues and civil rights issues, the discrimination case that came up recently as an example of that, sort of backtracking a little bit. But for the most part, the courts have been where you've laundered real political revolutions that have completely altered and fundamentally changed the structure of the government as we're taught in, middle school civics class. And it's also interesting. It's like, obviously the rising tensions here is that, it feels like we're inevitable to get a Trump Jacksonian moment. And, Mr. Roberts has made his decision. Now see him enforce it when it comes to whether it's going to be an immigration case or something like that. I feel like we're building up this case. But something that's also a quote that I saw this week or saw recently from Randy Barnett, I think is interesting because, I think this aspect of it in this broader populist movement that we have, I think often gets overlooked. And he was responding dismissively to a National Review article which was criticizing your Republicans' views on the courts, and Randy Barnett was making the case that that effectively you got MAGA, you got Trump because of John Roberts' Obamacare decision, and that basically if you want to understand why the Tea Party, which was Mr. Tri-Cornered Hat and pocket constitutions, to Trump that is in many people's eyes, right, just pure democratic power, it's because like that particular ruling demonstrated to rank and file constitutional conservatives how big of a joke this entire system was. And so I think within this larger environment of political norms decaying, right, distrust in the larger state decaying, things that we view as general positives but are criticized for giving fuel to dangerous populist elements both in America and you could argue this is particularly true in Europe. This has obviously played a major role in Brazil as well with the way the courts took over their political system there, is that this breakdown, this intellectual takeover of the courts that have been used to radicalize and launder very massive changes has destroyed who would otherwise be the institutionalists and the conservatives, quote unquote, in terms of respecting political institutions, that they have played perhaps the most active role in burning down that trust. And again, hopefully that leads to federalism, political decentralization, sort of things that we desire as a far better outcome than, the 20th century political system. But I think the court's role in this is I think underappreciated and paving the way to what we have right now.
Yeah, I think that the Roberts basically turnaround is reversal, is just suddenly deciding that, oh yeah, the Constitution authorizes Obamacare. I think it had two elements to it, right? Here you had a Bush appointee showing you that, right, these guys will just say anything if they think it helps their political position. And also just showing that, like, so obviously Obamacare was not authorized by the text of the U.S. Constitution. The court just made up a decision that backed up what they wanted the outcome to be. They backed into legal reasoning that produced a certain legal outcome. I mean, now the court's been doing that forever, right? And certainly one of the most egregious examples was when the court came out and they say, yeah, of course, Franklin Roosevelt can lock up Japanese people based on nothing more than their ethnicity in these concentration camps. Sure, of course, you have to let him do that. And where does the Constitution say you can't do that? I mean, they basically said that. So obviously, what a joke the court is when you look at things like that. But this was a more recent example that, as you say, though, right, it demonstrated to these Tea Party people that, I mean, come on, this just isn't serious. And I think this is just an ongoing issue now, looking at how, right, this idea that the Supreme Court specifically, right, isn't some sort of super legislature, right? These are people voting up and down based on what their ideological preferred positions are. Now, certainly they think in a certain way that's different from just your standard politician, because they don't have to stand for election and they have a different type of training. And so, sure, there's a difference there. But to say that, oh, they're going to go against their ideology based on what the law says, maybe that's true for a couple of these people, but it's certainly not how the court functions overall, as far as I can see. And I think it's become pretty obvious to a lot of just regular populists, Tea Party, MAGA types as well. So the more that happens, of course, I think the more it just leads into people just losing faith in the court overall and leading to a new situation. Like you, though, I hope it leads to real federalism, real decentralization, a real skepticism of federal power. But we shall see. I mean, the question, though, is like, why? And I think, I don't know. I really don't know the answer to this question. Why is the court seem so unified, right? Connor, you mentioned, it's a 96% failure rate for Trump on this. It's not like these are all Biden appointees, right? A lot of these judges are appointed by a lot of different candidates. They're coming from a lot of different backgrounds. So thinking as a federal judge, why are they so united against this Trump stuff that they seem to have such a lopsided bias on what the Trump administration is trying to do? I mean, I could imagine some answers, but what are your thoughts on it? I mean, Connor, let's just start with you.
I mean, I don't know too much about the specifics of those cases. I imagine it's some combination of, some of those cases are probably pretty easy once you look at the Constitution, especially the Constitution annotated. It's just a straightforward, like, no, they overstepped their bounds. But at the same time, even though a lot of these federal judges, and those cases a lot of them, weren't with the Supreme Court, it was with federal judges or federal courts at lower levels. A lot of these judges, like, even if they were technically a Trump appointee, most of them, I argue, have sort of this same commitment to the status quo that you find outside of the judicial branch, but, with all the establishment Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and especially with the bureaucrats that are staffing these executive agencies. It's just, if people come in and they want to change things around too much, there's sort of there's just an aversion to that within that entire kind of class of people. And I think the federal judiciary is very much a part of that. It's almost like asking the bureaucrats if they want to completely eliminate departments and just change everything. No, they're going to want to continue doing their jobs and keep getting more money and more power over things. I think you have that dynamic in the judicial branch as well.
Well, just think about it. Well, I mean, just think about it. I mean, you can't look at this from a partisan perspective because Trump's Republican Party is ideologically different than Bush's Republican Party or Daddy Bush's Republican Party in the right. And you think about, imagine a conservative law student, graduating in 2012, right? Just to pick off a particularly younger judge in the grand scheme of things, right? They're not going to view things the way that someone who might be graduating law school today, who is a Trump believing, intellectual law student is going to view the world. And so there's been a massive ideological shift that has come with Trump's Republican Party, for both better and for worse. One could argue, but it is reality of it. So it should not be surprising at all. Not only that other nominally Republican nominated judges do not share, that view of administrative power or whatever, or perhaps just have a personal revulsion to Trump and therefore rationalize whatever they want to stop that agenda. But even the sort of people that Trump was plucking out when he was in office the first time around, right? I mean, this is what's led to Trump attacking the Federalist Society in particular as sort of a group trust a brain trust, if you will, on identifying legal talent. I mean, there's some real underlying differences in legal philosophy, which is kind of just fascinating in a vacuum, right? Like we're seeing a very real ideological shift within this particular professional class of attorneys turned judges play out in real time right now. And so again, I'm not surprised at all that it doesn't matter your party affiliation per se, leading to the outcome of however the judges want to rationalize their verdicts.
All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of Power and Market. Thank you, Tho. Thank you, Connor, for joining me this week. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be back next week with more, so we'll see you next time.